The Civil War in England can't be seen in isolation. Although it had local causes, local effects, and took place in a particular place, doesn't mean that in fact it wasn't part of a much greater conflagration. A Europe-wide conflagration that really began with the Lutheran Revolt of 1517. The rise of Lutheranism in the Holy Roman Empire had divided all of Europe into mutually exclusive religious camps. And those camps, as we've seen in many instances, resorted to war in order to try and win some measure of advantage over the other. The situation then that we see in England is the same as the situation on the continent. On the continent, though, the roots in some ways were much more complicated because of the various religions struggling and also because of the complexity of the European state system. Also, religion was the outward and visible sign of really what was a much greater set of circumstances driving Europe to these continental-wide wars. And this was the need to reevaluate the power structure, the economic structure, and the whole state system that had developed over time. After all, religion was the only way, as I've said before, that you could actually challenge God's plan for man. You had to say that you were returning to actually what that plan was originally, what God really intended, and that somehow had been lost by the intervention of men with their imperfect ideas. And so the wars that we're going to discuss today, the 30 Years' War, a series of wars so horrific and so widespread and lasting such a long period of time, must be seen to some extent as not only the crystallization, the accumulation, but also the end of a series of religious wars brought about by that Lutheran revolt of 1517, at the end of which the situation in Europe took on a completely different perspective, driven by different elements of statecraft and different needs by different kinds of people. We have to return then to the situation as it was in Germany. The Treaty of Augsburg in 1555, remember, had established a tenuous peace between the religions of Lutheranism and Catholicism. And despite this, the wars that had developed as a consequence of this circumstance nevertheless challenged this simple-minded solution of allowing the individual prince to determine the religion of his people. What we see with the 30 Years' War, to some extent, is the Europe-wide resolution of this problem. It was an opportunity for all of Europe to address the question of religion and the relationship of new classes in society and new powers in terms of the only thing that would allow change to happen. And that is what was seen as a new religion, or a more perfect religion, or a purer religion that would allow all people to embrace a new order. The particularly horrible events of the 30 Years' War really began with, again, a spark. A spark that in itself was profound, but really which led to a series of other events that had far more consequence than that event in Bohemia. In 1609, the Emperor Rudolf II had granted Protestants in Bohemia wide toleration and indeed freedom to worship. His letter of majesty permitted the Hussites, who were really proto-Lutherans, those descendants of the followers of John Huss, who had been executed at Constance. They were given the right to practice their religion, again, provided that they didn't disrupt the fabric of the state. There were still tensions, of course, but those tensions were relatively stable until the accession of the Archduke Ferdinand to the Bohemian throne in 1617. Ferdinand was very, very different from his cousin. Ferdinand was a zealous Roman Catholic, raised by the Jesuits, and didn't want to see Protestantism of any kind practiced anywhere in the Habsburg dominions. He wanted to ensure that he was, in fact, the representative of the Catholic powers that would ultimately suppress Protestantism everywhere. On the 23rd of May, 1618, two imperial Catholic agents were sent to Prague to negotiate with the Bohemians. The Bohemians, though, felt that this situation had already become intolerable, and they responded in the traditional Czech way. They threw the two representatives out of the window of Prague Castle. This is the first defenestration of Prague. Fortunately, the two imperial agents actually survived. Their dignities were not intact, but they landed in the dunghill of the castle, and their fall was broken, and although they needed dry cleaning, they themselves were in fact fine. The Bohemian estates had a tradition of electing their king, and the Bohemian estates, broadly supported by the population, refused to accept the Archduke Ferdinand's authority. Because Bohemia then had a tradition of electing their monarch, they voted to depose Ferdinand and to join the defensive alliance against the Habsburgs. The Bohemian estates then went one step further to challenge Ferdinand by electing the leader of the Protestant alliance, Frederick of the Palatinate, as their king in 1618. The Habsburgs, not just in the empire, but also in Spain, couldn't permit the secession of the Kingdom of Bohemia from the Habsburg crown, because to do so would mean that huge dynastic collection of territories would perhaps evaporate. So Philip III, King of Spain, sent both troops and money to Ferdinand once they realized that compromise was impossible. Frederick refused Ferdinand's ultimatum in April of 1620 that demanded that Frederick vacate the throne of Bohemia and return to his capital at Heidelberg. The Bohemians, moreover, asked for support from the other Protestant nations of Europe, but received none. The result was an imperial army crossed into Bohemia and won an overwhelming victory against the Hussites at the Battle of White Mountain in November 1620. After which Frederick and his wife Elizabeth, who was the daughter of James I of England, by the way, left for their rather desperate exile. And there begins the romantic legend of Elizabeth, the Winter Queen, and the exile that the two of them shared together, moving from court to court, asking for some measure of hospitality. The Habsburg took this victory as a sign of divine recognition. God was giving them victory, so now they should then press on to ensure that the Protestants would be defeated everywhere, that the Catholic Habsburgs now had an opportunity to win a decisive victory over that Protestant religion that now was over a century old. In 1621, Philip of Spain, Philip III, renewed the conflict with the United Provinces of Holland, trying to destroy Calvinism there. But that act, together with the new energy of the empire on the eastern border of the Rhine, drove the French, in particular the cardinal that was the chief minister of King Louis XIII, Cardinal Richelieu, to act not as a cardinal of the Roman Church, not as a devout Catholic and the servant of the most Christian king, but rather, in fact, to ensure that France would be made secure. Consequently, the French began to provide subsidies to the enemies of the Catholic Habsburgs in the Netherlands and also to the King of Denmark. How could this be? Why was it that a cardinal of the Roman Church, serving a king that was anointed with the balm of Clovis, would be willing to sacrifice Catholicism and the potential victory of Catholicism in Europe for the sake of their own frontiers? Well, that's the answer to the question. What was more important was the security of France. This was beginning to outweigh the demands of religion. And already we can see this idea of religion being the ideology that would ultimately shape the course of European events becoming corroded by national self-interest. Ferdinand realized that this victory was his, decided that he was going to re-Catholicize the Kingdom of Bohemia. The Hussites had been active since the very beginning of the 15th century. This was a Reformation older than Luther and had very, very deep roots. But Ferdinand was not only a zealot, but he was ruthless. He executed the Protestant nobles who remained, he exiled those who had fled, and he gave their estates to zealous Roman Catholics to ensure that he would be re-elected to the throne of Bohemia. And of course he was. He brought in our friends the Jesuits, who started schools and began the recatechizing of the Czech people. He established monasteries and enriched them with the lands of Protestant nobles. He built churches. He succeeded in totally eliminating Protestantism in the Duchy of Austria itself and almost destroying it and certainly driving it underground in the Kingdom of Bohemia. But the flight of the Protestants from Bohemia and the circumstances of the huge amount of property that changed hands, and much of which was put on the market, resulted in an economic collapse. This economic collapse resulted in plummeting land prices. Land became very, very cheap. Moreover, the situation in Bohemia required a debasing of the currency. Ferdinand again took advantage of this. He saw this, in fact, as an opportunity, because he then encouraged Catholics from all over Europe to buy this land at very low price and to create what really amounts to a zealous zealous Catholic landholding class. Well, one of the individuals who bought a huge amount of land because he was wise enough to marry an extraordinarily wealthy woman was one Albert of Wallenstein, or Albrecht of Wallenstein. Wallenstein was a Czech noble, a minor noble, but one, through his wealthy marriage, was able to create vast estates from this extremely cheap land market. And Wallenstein was more than that. Wallenstein was not only an individual who was interested in creating enormous estates to make himself one of the premier nobles of Bohemia, he also was one of Europe's first military entrepreneurs. He realized that so many of the Catholic soldiers that had fought the Battle of the White Mountain and other places in Europe were in fact available for hire. So he asked whether they would be willing to serve him, and he established a private army made up of every nationality, hardened professional soldiers from Spain, from Ireland, from Scotland, many from Italy, all fought for Wallenstein. Moreover, Wallenstein's army was so effective, and Ferdinand realized that Wallenstein's army in Bohemia could be a great advantage, that Ferdinand hired Wallenstein to be his general and to be the leading force to confront the Protestants. The Protestant cause had a new leader in the King of Denmark, Christian IV, and he assumed leadership of the Protestant cause. But he was unable, because of the relatively small resources of his kingdom and because of the overwhelming strength of Wallenstein, to defeat the Imperials. So in 1626, Christian was defeated, and the imperial armies under Wallenstein began to expand their influence and actually move into Lutheran northern Germany. This terrified a large number of people, but no one as much as the King of Sweden, Gustavus Adolphus. Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, that great hero of the Protestant cause, that huge man, well over 6 feet tall, with a shock of golden hair and a large golden beard, braver than anyone, a brilliant military tactician who turned his northern kingdom into one of the great military powers of the 17th century, assumed leadership of the Protestant alliance. And he realized that the close proximity of the Habsburgs and the danger that Catholicism held for his own kingdom made him a much more aggressive power than, in fact, he felt he needed to be. Ferdinand, seeing that this situation was becoming ever more successful from his point of view, realizing that Wallenstein's army seemed to be almost invincible, and seeing the Protestants in disarray despite the leadership of Gustavus Adolphus, decided the time has come to turn back the clock. By 1629, the Habsburgs were at the height of their power, so Ferdinand felt confident enough to issue his famous Edict of Restitution on the 6th of March, 1629. This was a remarkable document because it was an instrument by which he was going to turn back the clock, because it said that all Catholic church lands taken by any Protestant since the Treaty of Augsburg of 1555 had to be returned. It was his attempt, of course, of trying to undo the Protestant Reformation. But what it succeeded in doing is hardening the Protestant resolve by alienating all of the North German Lutherans and all the Calvinists within the empire. It also took a huge toll on the empire by ensuring that there was going to be continuous war. The Edict of Restitution was in many ways impossible because that land had changed hands so many times. People had bought it in good faith. It would be impossible to actually do what Ferdinand had demanded. But nevertheless, he thought that he could bring it about, and what resulted was war. What in particular was the consequence of this war was the collapse of the economies of almost all states involved in this war that was beginning to spread so far and overtake any of its original causes. Spain found it difficult to pay its troops in the Netherlands, for example, and despite, in fact, because of the huge amount of wealth coming from the New World into Spain, The Spanish crown in 1627 was forced to declare bankruptcy. What caused this disjunction? One would think that Spain would have been the wealthiest country on the continent because of the inexhaustible gold and silver coming from the colonies in Central and Southern America. Well, in fact, Spain and this wealth largely brought about, first of all, what's called the Great Inflation of the 16th century, and also, because of this inflation, their own economic collapse. The bankruptcy of the Spanish crown didn't, though, end Spain's ability to fight. Spain, because of the dynastic demands, felt it necessary to continue support of the Habsburg cause. And the Spanish fought on, but not using money of their own in their bankrupt kingdom, but rather through forced contributions and extortion, again alienating large numbers of the population from the crown. At exactly the same time, the emperor was getting very nervous about Wallenstein. Wallenstein, after all, had a private army. It wasn't an imperial army. It wasn't an army that was raised in order to fight for the Habsburgs. It was an army raised by Wallenstein and rented to the Habsburgs. The control was Wallenstein's. So the emperor was getting very nervous that Wallenstein's ambitions were not the same as his own. And so he dismissed Wallenstein and told him to disband his army. Wallenstein, though, did not disband his army. He simply allowed it to pasture on his vast estates in Bohemia, waiting for the time that he knew would come when the emperor would need him once more. And France, although a Catholic country and largely ruled by a first minister in Cardinal Richelieu, feared Habsburg power much more than it feared Protestantism. And so the French, seeing the new energy of the Habsburgs in Spain, on its northern frontier, in the Spanish attempt to reconquer the Dutch provinces, and also in the empire, began to give huge amounts of money, this time to Gustavus Adolphus. France paid the Protestant Swedish king in order to fight the zealous Catholic Habsburgs, again reflecting that policy that the politique around Henry IV had begun to describe, and that is the greatest raison d'etat, the most important policy of monarchy is the protection of the kingdom, and even religion was secondary. And this was a policy that Richelieu knew well and practiced. Gustavus then was in a strong position. Gustavus had the money from the French. He equipped his army with the latest military equipment. He himself was a brilliant general and without fear, and the power that he had then assembled was directed precisely against the emperor who challenged him in the north of Germany. But there wasn't really the kind of wealth necessary for this long period of war. Not even the French subsidy was enough. So Gustavus Adolphus followed a pattern that had begun by Wallenstein. He allowed his armies to live off the land. They effectively could take what they wanted. If there was a cow in the field, they would butcher it. If there was a crop in the field, they would cultivate it and eat it. If there were things, wealth, things to be sold in the houses or the huts of the peasantry, they would take them. War then became total war. There was no distinction anymore between combatants and non-combatants. And in fact, in many ways, the population suffered even more than the soldiers. Add to this the religious animosity, the hatred that had developed between Protestants and Catholics, in part because of the actions of men like Ferdinand. The hatred allowed individuals who should have known better to slaughter one another in the name of God. Some of the most awful events of European history, the siege and conquest of the German town of Magdeburg, for example, in 1631. The entire population was slaughtered and the entire town was burned to the ground except for the cathedral. Defeated armies were either slaughtered or at best decimated, with every 10th soldier killed and every noble officer hanged. Protestants and Catholics equally participated in these kinds of atrocities. They were terrible and they were awful, but nevertheless it was necessary at a time of total war, a war that had lasted so long under such terrible economic conditions that the only way that the troops could continue would in fact be through this kind of awful atrocity, the suffering that they imposed on others. Gustavus' troops then imposed terrible suffering, imposed famine, and imposed death on those where his armies marched. Wallenstein had done the same because Wallenstein had made a pact with his soldiers. He wouldn't pay them or pay them much, but what they found, they could have. Gustavus, the leader of the Protestant cause, that heroic man always in the center of battle, met Wallenstein, who had been rehired by Ferdinand just as he had said he would be. Ferdinand needed Wallenstein because that was the only force able to stop this newly energized Protestant alliance under the King of Sweden. Wallenstein, the great general, met Gustavus Adolphus, the great general, at the Battle of Lutzen in 1632. And Wallenstein saw Gustavus Adolphus die. Gustavus Adolphus was killed, and it seemed as though, with the death of the heroic leader of the Protestants, that Ferdinand had once more triumphed. But there was something else happening. Wallenstein hadn't pursued this victory, hadn't followed up with his usual vigor. In fact, he held back. Ferdinand, still distrusting him, had reason now to distrust him more. Why wasn't Wallenstein being more active, being more aggressive, now that the King of Sweden was dead, where his successor was a child, a young girl who would grow up to be Queen Christina? The distrust grew when it was reported to Ferdinand that Wallenstein was requiring all of his officers to swear allegiance not to Ferdinand and the Empire, but to Wallenstein personally. And there were persistent rumors that Wallenstein was plotting to make himself the King of Bohemia. Ferdinand, having begun these terrible wars, this conflagration that was destroying the European continent, had begun them because of the situation in Bohemia. He wasn't now going to permit Wallenstein to take the crown for which he had suffered so much. So in 1634, Ferdinand hired some Scots mercenaries to murder Wallenstein, and they succeeded. The problem was that with the death of Wallenstein, Ferdinand also lost his most effective military machine. By now, the tensions between the Catholics and the Protestants in the empire had begun to subside. The death of the leaders of both sides, of both armies, Wallenstein and Gustavus Adolphus, and the recognition that Ferdinand was no longer in control, allowed Ferdinand to rescind the Edict of Toleration, permitted Ferdinand to rescind the Edict of Restitution. A face-saving clause was that this was only supposed to be for a period of 40 years, and then in 1675 the land was to be returned. But everybody knew that Ferdinand had yielded and had decided that he could not turn back the clock and end the Reformation. German Protestants then began increasingly doing what Gustavus had done, what the King of Denmark, Christian IV, had done, look to Catholic France for deliverance. And the Spanish Habsburgs saw that the only way that the Habsburg cause was in fact going to succeed was if France should be defeated. So another element of the war, another part of this terrible Europe-wide war was fought between 1635 and 1648, mostly between France and Spain. The Spanish, despite their economic problems, were in a strong position, and they managed to cross the Pyrenees and wreak havoc on French territory, almost conquering Paris. But a revolt in Spain with the army elsewhere, the Catalan Republic announced its own independence. The province of Catalonia declared a republic, and Richelieu and Louis XIII, those creators of absolutism in France, recognized and bankrolled a republic. Similarly, Portugal, which had been united dynastically with Spain, revolted and reaffirmed its independence. All that could happen was that the Spanish armies that were threatening the French capital had to withdraw back across the Pyrenees in order to suppress the Catalan Republic and to ensure that Portugal would at least not join the enemy camp. With the movement of the Spanish army out of France, the French followed quickly, and then the French inflicted the same level of damage on Spain that the Spanish had done in France. By now, the entire continent was weary of fighting. So many hundreds of thousands, millions of lives had been lost. The major powers had begun as early as 1637 to call for peace. Ferdinand died in 1637, and that removed one of the forces that had caused all of this to begin with, and one of the forces that made some measure of compromise and negotiation impossible. But it wasn't until 1644 that serious peace negotiations really began. And the two sides, the Protestants and the Catholics, hated one another to such a large degree that they wouldn't even meet in the same towns. So two towns, side by side, were chosen in southwestern Germany, an area known as Westphalia. And this area became then the center of international diplomacy for almost 4 years as the two blocks of power began to negotiate, trying to work some form of compromise that would allow a treaty to be signed that would end this terrible period of war, which now had lasted almost 30 years. The result was the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648. This was to establish the foundations of the European state system until the Congress of Vienna. What in fact we see at Westphalia is again something new in Europe, a new element in European statecraft and in diplomacy. Previously, wars had ended with negotiation between the major combatants. These were usually the most powerful states meeting together as parties of equals. The 30 Years' War had far, far greater coverage than that. An entire continent had been involved. Every major state in Europe had been involved. You couldn't have bilateral discussions. The only solution was a general meeting, a conference that would include all of the combatants, great and small. The model for this, interestingly enough and significantly, were the great councils of the church. Councils like Constance that had brought together the leaders of Roman Catholicism from all over the continent in order to solve the fundamental problems of the church, such as Constance did with the issue of the Great Schism. But now this was a secular meeting of secular powers represented by secular diplomats. And they worked together in order to try and reach a modus vivendi that would allow finally, after this terrible time, peace to descend once more on Europe. By 1648, the economies of almost every European state were shattered. The areas where the war had been fought most violently and had, for the longest period, suffered the most. In Bohemia, for example, a census in 1648 found that 29,000 villages were totally destroyed or abandoned. In the province of Alsace, famine forced the population to cannibalism, eating not only the immediate dead, but raiding graveyards so that they, in fact, could have some meat. In Germany, the population fell from about 20 million to 16 million people. 4 million died in those 30 years of war, not just from the effects of battle, but also from the starvation and the economic dislocation caused by a war that had become so overwhelming that it was impossible to sustain anything like normal life in that period. At Westphalia, the diplomats agreed on the issue of religion as well. Westphalia recognized not only Lutheranism, but also Calvinism, and the restitution of all church land sold after 1624 was one of the few elements that in fact permitted some kind of face saving for those who believed that the appropriation of ecclesiastical land was in fact immoral. The policy of cuius regio, that is, the prince would determine the religion of his subjects, was abandoned in favor of toleration for private worship. Well, why is this so significant? Why is the idea of private worship, as opposed to allowing the prince to determine the dominant religion in his territory, so significant? Well, it's a modern concept of religious toleration. It is the beginning of the idea of the spirit belonging to the individual and not the state. It moved directly against not just the forces of the Inquisition of the Roman Church, but more directly against the kind of legislation of morality that Calvin in Geneva and the Puritans in England had imposed upon the population. It was a recognition that ultimately your spirit belongs to yourself and you will approach God in the way that you see most appropriate. There were new states created. The independence of the United Provinces of Holland was recognized, and the state of Switzerland was created out of the Holy Roman Empire, creating another state where previously there had just been another territory ruled by the House of Habsburg. In fact, the area where the family of Habsburg itself originated. Europe that emerged from the 30 Years' War was a very different place from the Europe that had entered it. First of all, the German religious political situation was largely settled finally. And local princes gained a great deal more autonomy. They were able to tax, they were able to defend themselves, they were able to legislate, regardless what the Holy Roman Emperor said. In other words, the empire was becoming just a kind of idea, a mythical place rather than a real state. And the Golden Bull recognized it as a prince's state, in which the princes really ruled, and that's where power resided, not with the emperor. The religious issues had been now superseded by dynastic, political, and strategic issues. Concerns that would now dominate Europe were no longer those of confessional allegiance, but rather ones of the advantage of a king and his policy over other kings and other policies. France emerged as the most powerful state, and Spain had been humiliated with its bankruptcy and its inability to rise from that position. The empire lost its authority, and the opportunity of the Habsburgs to impose a Catholic solution on Europe, something dreamed of by Charles V, was now an impossibility. The concept then of territorial sovereignty, the concept of the secular state, the concept of centralized government and bureaucratic administration, permanent standing armies and international diplomacy, all of these things were put in place by the circumstances of the 30 Years' War and by the Treaty of Westphalia. And it was these things that ultimately would give the possibility, would create the environment in which the policy of absolutism could develop. And when we see absolutism in theory and practice arise in the next lecture, we must remember that it was built upon the needs and the structures required by 30 years of total warfare across an entire continent.